One very important topic in any conversation about drug abuse is drug abuse prevention, or whether or not anything can be done to prevent drug abuse before it starts. So let's start off by talking about the government. The government tries to prevent drug abuse by making certain substances illegal. And by doing so, they are attempting to limit the availability of those substances, which is a form of prevention. The government also tries to prevent use and abuse by punishing those who use and sell substances. And the idea here, of course, is that people don't like to be punished, so they're not going to use and abuse substances if that leads to punishment. Another way that people try to prevent drug use and drug abuse is through a number of programs that are aimed at children, preteens, and teens. And these programs are often presented in schools, religious groups, and youth groups. And their aim is to stop drug use before it starts. You might be familiar with some of these programs. You might have gone through them yourself when you were in elementary school or middle school. But two very popular ones are DARE, which stands for Drug Abuse Resistance Education, and another program called Just Say No. These types of programs might be taught by teachers and integrated into existing curricula, or they might be taught by someone who was brought in from outside the school, which could include guest speakers or even police officers. And these types of programs, though all somewhat different from each other, tend to focus on three main things. The first is factual information about drugs, and this information is usually followed by stories of bad things that happen to people who use these substances. And they also typically include training that aims at boosting children's self-esteem, with the goal of helping them resist peer pressure that might lead them to use drugs later on. A lot of time and money has been spent implementing these programs, and they certainly have good intentions. But over 20 years of evaluation into these programs have shown that these programs are not effective. Individuals who participate in these programs are just as likely to use substances as those who do not participate. In fact, some studies have shown that these programs might actually be counterproductive, that sometimes there is actually a higher rate of substance abuse among individuals who participate in these programs. And if there is any effectiveness, that effectiveness is very limited, and it only works for a short period after the intervention. It doesn't usually have an effect in the long term. And I've mentioned all three possible conclusions here, and I don't mean to confuse you. So just to be clear, while there are some studies that show increased or decreased drug use in individuals who participate in these programs, a vast majority of them show no difference. And so now you might be wondering, why in the world do these very well-intentioned programs have such a high failure rate? One reason might be that these programs are targeting kids who are just too young to really understand these messages. And there are a large number of these programs that focus on kids before they reach their teenage years. Maybe it's really easy for them to say that they will say no to drugs before they can really understand the pressures and social implications that can surround that decision. But at the same time, there are also programs that focus on individuals in their teenage years. And it's possible that teens might be too old for these messages. Maybe kids in this age range have already learned about substance use from their peers, and so they can't be inoculated against drug use. And as you might have noticed, these two things kind of contradict each other. So what really might be driving this is content. It might be the case that information that works well with younger kids doesn't work for older ones, and vice versa. There are probably some messages that we can give teens that would be meaningless to elementary school students. And so the key here might be finding the right balance of information. And maybe these programs don't have that balance figured out yet. And this reminds me of another point that I wanted to bring up about content. And that's that programs that rely on scare tactics are generally ineffective. And we don't totally understand why this is. It might be that even though kids and teens and preteens understand the messages of these programs, they may not think that the consequences apply to them. And so while they might be receptive to scare tactics in the short term, it isn't going to affect their long-term decision-making. What about programs that just provide the facts about drug use and leave out any scare tactics or moralistic messages? Well, it turns out that unfortunately, these programs aren't effective either. What about programs that boost self-esteem? programs that have students take an oath that say that they're going to say no to drugs. As you might have guessed from following this pattern, these programs don't seem to influence drug use either. But what about those studies that actually showed an increase in drug use? The studies that show that participants of these programs use substances more than non-participants. In this case, it's possible that participating in these programs might lead students to think that substance use is actually more popular than it really is. So they might be inadvertently normalizing drug use for these students, making them believe, incorrectly I might add, that drugs are something that everyone is doing. And by accidentally transmitting this message, it might actually make these students more likely to use drugs. It's also possible that by telling students about drugs, by making them aware of them and by giving them general knowledge about them, it might lead them to be more curious about some of the drugs that they learn about. So we've talked a whole lot about things that don't work. And now I want to shift gears for a bit and talk about some things that do. Programs that use peers or older adolescents to teach drug prevention programs might be mildly more effective than programs that use adults. Although I will say that this is not supported by all studies. Because in general, it's less about who teaches and more about what is taught. Programs that focus on developing social skills more broadly, as well as teaching things like self-control and stress management, have had some success. And that doesn't mean that programs shouldn't include factual information about substances, or include messages about self-esteem and peer pressure. It just means that these things should be presented alongside other content.